Welcome to tonight's lecture. My name is John Brockup. I teach in the History and Religious Studies program here at Penn State. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Muhammad Khalil, my dear friend from Michigan State, to talk with us tonight. This lecture is sponsored by the Center for Global Studies, the History Department, and the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum. I just want to say a word about this last group because this is the very reason why Muhammad is with us tonight. The Digital Islamic Studies curriculum is a consortium within the Big Ten schools that seeks to share resources about Islamic studies. We got it figured out. Yeah, thank you. About Islamic studies within the Big Ten. And so, for example, I last year taught the Crusades physically here at Penn State and virtually at Michigan State. This semester, Muhammad Khalil is teaching Religion of Islam physically at Michigan State and then virtually here at Penn State. And he's with us this first week because they haven't started yet. So he's giving up part of the last week of his summer vacation to be with us, be with our students, and to lecture to us tonight. Muhammad Khalil is Associate Professor of Religious Studies, an Adjunct Professor of Law, and Director of the Muslim Studies program at Michigan State. A specialist in Islamic thought, he has published numerous articles and book chapters on various topics from early Islamic historiography to bioethics in venues such as the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture, Religion Compass, Comparative Islamic Studies, and Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. Muhammad is the author of Islam and the Fate of Others, The Salvation Question from Oxford University Press, and editor of Between Heaven and Hell, Islam, Salvation, and the Fate of Others, also from Oxford. His newest book, Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, and it's the basis of his talk tonight, which is ISIS, Jihad, and Islamic Law. Please join me with a warm welcome for Muhammad.
Thank you so much. Professor Brockup is a gracious host, and he is somebody that's widely respected in our field of Islamic studies. And frankly, Penn State, any university would be lucky to have him. So thank you, Professor Brockup. So this is a grim subject, a very grim subject. And frankly, I'd rather talk about something else. But I feel compelled to address this issue. Especially with all that's going on. And just last week, we saw what happened in Barcelona. And there have been many terrorist attacks committed either in the name of ISIS or an attack that was maybe influenced by ISIS indirectly. And at the heart of all these discussions is this term, jihad. And it seems like everybody and their brother and sister has something to say about jihad. And you have all these scholars and pseudo-scholars publishing books, writing articles, etc., trying to explain to everyone what jihad really is. And so it gets it's kind of hard to make sense of things at times. Especially because you have, with this term jihad, many on one side saying, it's holy war against infidels, that's what jihad is, and then on the other side you have people saying jihad has nothing to do with fighting. And the reality is much more complicated than that. Let me share a story. When I was a junior in high school, I got my driver's license, I got the keys to the car, and my grades took a dip. My grades went down dramatically. I was enjoying life. And one night I decided, you know what, that's enough, I'm going to study hard tonight. And now granted, it was the night before spring break ended, I had a ton of homework due, but still, here I was, 2 in the morning, studying, finishing my homework. My father, who's Egyptian, comes in, he sees me, and he says, Muhammad, that's a great jihad. Now I can assure you he was not saying that's a great holy war against infidels. Okay? Jihad, the most basic definition of jihad is struggle, striving, an exertion of effort for what is perceived to be a noble cause. It can include a wide range of things. It can include praying for hours in a mosque. It can include fighting on the battlefield. And Muslims use this term in a variety of ways. I like to think of the term crusade. If you want something to think about for a moment, think of the word crusade for a moment. We use this term in a variety of ways. Crusade for Christ. Crusade against hunger. Right? But then if you go to Egypt and you say this word crusade to a group of Egyptians, they might have a very different reaction. Forget Egypt, even here among some people, right? So people react to these terms in very different ways. When Muslims use it in a religious context, it can mean a wide variety of things. But in the context of Islamic law, when you read an Islamic legal manual and you see this term jihad, there it typically refers to armed jihad. So then, what is the purpose of armed jihad? Is it strictly for defensive purposes? Is it to conquer the world? What is the purpose of armed jihad? This is a huge subject, and I don't have time to get into it. So instead what I'll do is, I'll do sort of the cheap thing and mention some titles of works you could look at on this issue. The first would be Striving in the Path of God by Asma of Saruddin. This is a book that looks at, it's not really legal per se, but it's looking at how commentaries on the Quran talk about jihad and talk about passages that pertain to jihad, and it looks at it historically. And along the way, she debunks, Professor of Saruddin debunks various myths about jihad. And she's a professor at Indiana University, widely respected scholar in the field. Another work I'd recommend is The Islamic Law of War by Dr. Ahmed al-Dawoodi, The Islamic Law of War. And then finally, I would recommend an article by my old PhD advisor, he's not old, but you know what I mean, Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson, and it's an article called Jihad in the Modern World. These works will give you a sense of how Muslims grapple with this question. What is the purpose of armed jihad? And for some Muslims, it's strictly defensive. For others, it is more than that. But my focus here tonight is going to be the rules of warfare. So once a war is already underway, what are the rules of warfare? And the rule I'm going to focus on tonight is the rule pertaining to non-combatants. And one of the most widely accepted legal principles, not just in the realm of the rules of war, but just in general, is this rule right here. The non-combatant women and prepubescent children may not be targeted in combat. This is across the board accepted by Muslim scholars. And the reason for this is you have explicit statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad where he says, do not kill women and children. And it's widely accepted. You'll find it in the most important hadith collections of sayings of the Prophet, reports about the Prophet. For example, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. But now you're probably wondering, well, wait a minute, what about the guys? What about non-combatant men? There are various statements attributed to the Prophet where he says that various categories of men are not to be harmed. The elderly, the disabled, farmers, the hired servants who are maybe on the battlefield with the enemy, but they're hired servants, they're not fighting. So you have various statements of varying levels of authenticity where the Prophet forbids the harming various categories of non-combatant men. And the vast majority of Muslim scholars recognize at least this idea that there are categories of men that should not be harmed. Nevertheless, there was a minority opinion historically that said that if you are dealing with an enemy man, so a non-Muslim who is not under Muslim rule, or not in a state of peace, so they don't belong to a state where you have a peace treaty or a truce, then all of enemy men they are to be treated as combatants. But again, that's a minority perspective. But it's there, it exists. Even though it runs counter to various statements attributed to the Prophet. Okay, now I stress this because I want to show you that with women and children, there's really no debate on that among the major Muslim scholars. You really don't see serious debate on that issue. And in fact, even in the writings of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they will say, yeah, we know you're not supposed to target women and children, but that's what we're going to get into. Okay. So now we're going to talk about ISIS, also known as ISIL, also known as IS, also known as Daesh. We could go on. And I should tell you why I'm talking about this. What was the inspiration? What's the motivation? A couple of years ago, actually now it'd be almost 3 years ago, I was watching an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria and Sam Harris, the very prominent New Atheist writer. And Harris made the claim that Osama bin Laden's reading of the Quran, of Islamic sources, is straightforward. It's honest. And I began to investigate further, and I see that Sam Harris makes similar claims in many of his works, in his blog posts, in his books, and he makes the same claim about ISIS. So there is this idea that ISIS members are literalists, they're going by what they read, and they are honest about what their religion really teaches. And so I decided, okay, well, let's look into this. Let's see. Are ISIS members really literalists? Let's analyze the writings of ISIS. Okay, so this was, as I say, a very grim project. So I began looking at the writings of ISIS. Now I had to go to some academic website to access these, because I didn't want to go to the actual website, or else I wouldn't be here today. So I went to these academic sites and I downloaded their online magazine. They actually have one before this called Dabiq, and now they have Rumiyya. Rumiyya is Arabic, one way of saying Rome. And you can, it's hard to read, but right there next to issue 5, it says, there's a quote by Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, who was the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, which preceded ISIS in Iraq. And it says, O muwahideen, those of you who are true monotheists, rejoice, for by Allah, by God, we will not rest from our jihad except beneath the olive trees of Rumiyya, of Rome. Okay. And so this is the name of their online magazine. And I decided to look at several of their articles, but for our purposes, because we're up against the clock, I decided to focus on one of their articles, Collateral Carnage. I have to tell you, I've seen many R-rated movies in my time. I have never been as disturbed as when I went through these ISIS magazines. You will see images that you won't see in R-rated movies. And these are real images. Very gruesome, very shocking, and I think that's sort of the intended purpose. It's intended to provoke. And also intended to provoke those opposed to ISIS, but also intended maybe to galvanize those who might be sympathetic to ISIS. So this article, Collateral Carnage, the reason I decided to focus on this for this lecture is that I find that of all the articles I've come across in Rumiyya, this is the one that most directly relates to this issue of terrorism in the name of ISIS. In fact, the article, so this comes out January 2017, the author praises the Nice attack in France that had occurred several months earlier where a man took a truck and rammed through people and killed, I think it was 84, something like that. So the article presents a justification for terrorism against enemies. Okay, so there's already an assumed state of war between ISIS and the West and various nations, I should say. And there the author, and by the way, the author, it's anonymous, we don't know who the author is, but the author presents a justification for terrorism. And here's how the author does this. The author presents all enemy men. So, if you're taking the case of France, Nice, France, all the French men who are non-Muslim as legitimate targets. And all other civilians who may be harmed, they are presented as collateral casualties. How do they justify this? Well, what I'm going to show you now are two major justifications. And I want to stress here that I'm just showing you how ISIS presents them. I'm going to show you later how most Muslim scholars think about these things. For now, I'm just showing you how ISIS presents these things. So they offer two major justifications, at least in this article. The first justification is, they say, that the Prophet Muhammad used catapults at Ta'if. Ta'if is a city to the southeast of Mecca, not far from Mecca. And so he's saying that the Prophet used catapults, and the assumption there is that he's using a weapon of mass destruction, and women and children are killed in the process. That's the assumption. And again, I want to stress, this is how ISIS presents it. The second justification is a hadith, a report about the Prophet. And in this report, one of the Prophet's companions asked him whether it would be permissible to attack an enemy force at night, as such an attack could lead to collateral casualties. The Prophet indicated that this would be permissible. And this appears in the collection, the famous hadith collection or sayings of the Prophet, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which are two very important sources of hadiths. Again, hadith is a report of something the Prophet said or did or tacitly approved. These collections in particular are, without a doubt, the two most widely respected sources among Sunni scholars. And ISIS, of course, they are coming from a Sunni background. Okay. So, going back to this, they're saying, look, here's a report. Somebody asks the Prophet, is it okay to attack the enemy at night? There could be collateral casualties because we might not see everything. The Prophet says, yes, that's permitted. According to this report. We'll come back to this. The author then goes on to say, even though the report just has somebody asking the Prophet, is it okay? The author goes a step further and says, actually, the best practice when conducting raids is to start during the night or at the break of dawn, before the sun rises, while the enemy is asleep. And no light shines, and an adult male is not easily distinguishable from women and children. So the author, he or she, is actually encouraging people to attack when there would be a greater likelihood for collateral casualties. How does the author justify this, that it's best to attack at night? Remarkably, by conflating the human with the divine, they point to the example of God. In the Quran, you have stories of people who rejected their prophets, were wicked, insolent, didn't help the poor, and so on, and they are punished by God. And there's a passage, Surah 7, chapter 7, verse 4, which depicts God punishing people when they were sleeping, destroying the wicked when they were sleeping. And so the author says, well, look, if that's God's practice, That's good then. We should follow that example. In conclusion, the author says, one should not avoid targeting gatherings of the kuffar, unbelievers, whether military or civilian, in which kafir, unbelieving women and children outnumber the kafir, unbelieving men. So, actually encouraging attacks on large gatherings of people, even when there are more women and children than men, and again, for them, all the men are enemy combatants. Oh, and by the way, I just want to pause here, time out. When I was referring to the medieval discussions, I used this word combatant, right? I've seen some authors say, oh, this is modern terminology. No. The medieval Muslim scholars did use al-muqatilah, and that's the combatants. Okay, so this is not some modern terminology. But back to this now. So here the author is saying, yeah, attack large gatherings. And you see that with Barcelona, exactly. The guy drives through large gatherings of men, women, and children. And the author goes on to say, to advocate the use of missiles and explosives. Okay? But again, also praises the Nice attack, the French attack with the truck. Okay. Now, let me just pause here to tell you that Muslims obviously have come out very strongly against ISIS, contrary to maybe what some might hear. This is one unfortunate thing where you get people saying, well, how come Muslims aren't condemning? How come Muslims aren't whatever? They are. You just have to do a Google search. And that happened back in September of 2001, and it's happening with ISIS. So when you look at Muslim juristic responses, scholars of Islam, how they respond to ISIS, we see that they generally come out very strongly against ISIS. For example, there is the open letter to al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi, of course, is the self-proclaimed caliph of ISIS. And this is a letter signed by over 120 scholars, which offers point-by-point refutations of some of ISIS's claims. I have to say, it's kind of shallow in the sense that they just kind of offer brief little responses, but the point is that it's showing a very strong rejection of ISIS. You also have various scholars condemning ISIS, like the Saudi Grand Mufti Abdulaziz al-Sheikh, who says ISIS and Al-Qaeda are enemy number one of Islam. You have the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, arguably the most prominent scholar in Egypt, Ahmad al-Tayyib, saying ISIS militants are operating under the guise of this holy religion while exporting their false Islam. And in December 2015, there was a fatwa issued by, yes, that is correct, you're not seeing it wrong. When I read this, I was like, what? Yeah, 70,000 Sunni scholars from the Indian Barlevi movement. There was this major conference, and they issued this statement saying ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban are not Islamic organizations, and significantly, that their members are not Muslims. That's significant because in Islam, for at least in most schools of thought, it's really hard to say somebody's not a Muslim when they're saying they're Muslim, from a theological standpoint. Someone could do the most heinous crimes imaginable, but they would still be considered Muslim, and maybe even a hell-bound Muslim, but still Muslim. So to say somebody's not a Muslim, that's a big deal. So how then do Muslim scholars react to ISIS and their arguments for terrorism? What I'm about to show you is the kinds of responses that sort of mainstream Muslim scholars offer to the kinds of claims made by ISIS. So, let us revisit the Collateral Carnage article. First of all, before we even get into the justifications for terrorism, let's point out that this assumes a state of war between ISIS and various nations, and you should know that, as polling data indicates, the vast majority of Muslims do not consider ISIS legitimate to begin with. So, right off the bat, there's a problem. But let's go now to the arguments for terrorism. First, the Collateral Carnage article presents all enemy men as combatants. And for most Muslim scholars, this is extremely problematic. First of all, it runs counter to various statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, as I mentioned earlier. And interestingly, it even runs counter to other issues of Rumayyah. So this is the January 2017 Collateral Carnage, January 2017. May 2017, you have a very different claim. You have this article saying, oh yeah, so secluded monks should not be harmed, the elderly men should not be harmed. I mean, it just gives this list of men that shouldn't be harmed. So it even contradicts actually other issues of Rumayyah, and by the way, other issues of other radical organizations. So for example, I was looking at Inspire, strange name, for the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's magazine. And they also speak of certain men that should not be harmed. Okay. The article also, Collateral Carnage, presents all other civilians who may be harmed as collateral casualties. And the two justifications they offer, the first is that the Prophet Muhammad used catapults at Ta'if. And so the idea, again, the assumption is that he is potentially, he's harming women and children because he's using a weapon of mass destruction. Well, I wanted to investigate this further, and I noticed that this is not something that appears in the major hadith collections like Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. It actually appears in the biographies of the Prophet. And when I started looking at all the different accounts, of the major accounts, so for those of you who are familiar with Islamic thought, looking at the history of Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Tabari, and others, here's what I sort of pieced together. You have the Prophet fighting a tribe called Banu Thaqif in the city of Ta'if. And the Muslim forces are unable to penetrate the wall, the fortress. And the Prophet's companion, Salman al-Farisi, Salman the Persian, who always conveniently shows up with good military suggestions, says, well, you know, in Persia, we have this thing where we use mangonels. Now, a mangonel is a kind of catapult. It's used to throw large stones, and it's used to breach walls and fortresses. So, Salman says, yeah, we use mangonels to breach walls and fortresses. So the Prophet says, okay, let's try it. So the Muslims prepare this mangonel, and they bring it to launch it at the wall. The wall is guarded by combatants from Banu Thaqif. And they begin firing scraps of hot iron. I can never pronounce that word. Iron. And they shoot them with these scraps of hot iron, and the Muslims aren't even able to get the mangonel to work. And 12 of them die. 12 Muslims die. So the Muslims aren't even able to use it because you have people attacking them from the wall. And so when you look at the prophetic biographies, we see Muhammad attempted to use a mangonel once in a failed attempt to breach a wall guarded by combatants. Which is very different from what you would sense from just reading the Prophet shot catapults at Ta'if. And by the way, Muslim scholars historically drew a distinction between stones and fire, in that some Muslim scholars prohibited the use of fire in warfare. Others did not, but others did. So there was a tension there. But you don't sense this tension when you read this article. It's never hinted at even. Just as it's not even hinted at that the idea that all enemy men are combatants is a small minority view. You don't even sense it in the article. So the diversity is gone. It's absent. The second justification is that One of the Prophet's companions asked him whether it would be permissible to attack an enemy force at night, as such an attack could lead to collateral casualties. The Prophet indicated that this would be permissible. And the author goes on to say it's best to attack at night while the enemy is sleeping, because that's the example of God. God killed the wicked when they were sleeping. Well, what about the example of Muhammad? Interestingly, the author makes no reference to and seems to be unaware of a widely known hadith, widely known report that appears in Sahih al-Bukhari. Again, the most respected source of sayings of the Prophet. And we read in Sahih al-Bukhari that whenever the Prophet reached a people by night, he never started an attack until it was morning. So we have this other report. Somebody asked the Prophet, hey, can we attack an enemy force at night? Sure. But then we have the other report saying that he himself never did an attack at night. And we actually read, for example, when he reaches Khaybar. There are various sources that describe this. He reaches the city of Khaybar at night, but he waits until the people of Khaybar are awake the next morning. So, interesting, and again, you don't sense this at all in the collateral casualties article. There's no reference to this, no sign that the author is aware of this. And the author advocates the use of missiles and explosives on civilian targets. Remember, the author says, target the gathering of unbelievers. Well, from the perspective of most Muslim scholars, ISIS killings of non-combatants are far more intentional than what is permitted in early Islamic sources. So, you think about a night raid where you're not sure exactly what you're seeing, versus targeting a group of men, women, and children using highly destructive technology and weapons. From the perspective of most Muslim scholars, the claim that such killings are collateral is disingenuous and goes against the explicit prohibition against killing women and children, which again is widely accepted. Again, even ISIS accepts that they're not supposed to kill women and children. I remember when I was looking at also bin Laden for my book, bin Laden in an interview says, yeah, we're not supposed to kill women and children, but, and actually bin Laden's reasoning was a little bit different. He gets into this collateral thing a little bit, but one of the big claims that he makes is that if the enemy kills your women and children, you can kill their women and children, and he gives the names of 4 scholars who said this, 4 medieval scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, Shawkani, and al-Qurtubi. And I remember reading that and thinking, I don't remember them saying that. So I went back and looked at these scholars and their writings, and what I found was that they say if the enemy uses fire, like you can use fire, that kind of thing. But they never say anything about targeting women and children. And actually, one of the 4 scholars bin Laden mentioned, in a section that bin Laden must have read over, explicitly says if the enemy kills your women and children, you cannot kill their women and children, even if it caused you anger. That's in al-Qurtubi. So, in any case, some closing thoughts. Like many other Muslims, the leadership of ISIS uses early Islamic texts to justify their actions. But the justifications put forward by ISIS for terrorism require the abandonment of both strict literalism and the prevailing interpretations of Islamic law, past and present. Now, look, it's true, most Muslims are not literalists. Most Muslims are not literalists. But I just want to stress here that their terrorism requires the abandonment of literalism. That's, I think, something that has to be stressed. Because when we go back to this question, this claim of Sam Harris, that they're literalists, that they're honest, as far as I can see, the evidence doesn't bear that out. And actually, I want to reference Bernard Lewis. Sam Harris likes to quote Bernard Lewis in his book, The End of Faith. And I think it's safe to say that Lewis is not an apologist for Islam. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay. So here's what Bernard Lewis has to say, and this is a passage I have not seen Harris quote or reference, It came out after the end of faith by a few years, but I haven't seen Harris reference this. Here's what Bernard Lewis has to say in a co-authored book. The emergence of the by now widespread terrorism practice of suicide bombing is a development of the 20th century. It has no antecedents in Islamic history and no justification in terms of Islamic theology, law, or tradition. It is a pity that those who practice this form of terrorism are not better acquainted with their own religion and with the culture that grew up under the auspices of that religion. And finally, because this has been such a grim lecture, I'm looking around the room, everyone looks so... Because this is such a dark lecture, I figured I'd end on maybe a brighter note. So, I could have picked any number of scholars, Muslim scholars, but I figured as a point of contrast, let's look at this figure, Muhammad Afifi al-Akiti. He has a very influential book on jihad, the rules of jihad, called Defending the Transgressed, which was published in English in 2005. Defending the Transgressed. And it's considered a fatwa, a scholarly opinion. And in it, he cautions against losing hope in Allah, God, when the military option is not a legal one. And for him, he is pretty clear that you fight really for defensive purposes. Okay? And he recognizes, there are a lot of problems right now among Muslims throughout the world. But one should not lose hope in God. He references a famous hadith, a famous saying of the Prophet that appears in multiple hadith collections, which is, the best jihad is a true word in the face of a tyrannical ruler. And he adds, it is possible still, and especially today, to fight injustice through other forms of jihad, through your tongue and your words, and through the pen and the courts. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
How did you feel of your own questions?
Oh, and by the way, don't be shy. I've heard them all. Yes. Right, yeah.
So I have a medieval question, because I'm a medievalist.
Yes.
Is there, even at the same time in the medieval world that wars are going on, and there are Christian wars and there are mixed wars, there are Christian authors going back to Augustine in the 5th century, and you've got Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century who are grappling with the idea of just war. And in many cases they prove that there are ways, there are forms of just war. And so this is even as there are wars going on in the medieval period, whether they're among Christians or among Christians and Jews or Christians and Muslims.
Or Christians and Muslims against Christians and Muslims,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are there similar debates or questions going on amongst the scholars of the medieval world in the Islamic world at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I really like Asma Afsaruddin's book. I mean, it's a book on Quranic commentary, but she's showing you the range of interpretations and how things evolve over time. So that, for example, people like to talk about Ayatul Sayf, the sword verse, which is Surah 9, chapter 9, verse 5. And they make a big deal out of this verse, and she actually shows that some early scholars, first of all, this terminology was kind of developed. I mean, you don't see commentators using that terminology until later. And one of the arguments that she makes is that, there's this assumption that pre-modern Muslim scholars assume that that you have to fight to conquer the world. Well, actually, she shows scholars who only stress medieval scholars, who stress the defensive nature of warfare. And she says that you find that those scholars who tend to be closer to political centers tend to be more likely to push for conquest, and those away from the political centers tend to be more about, their focus is defensive warfare. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go there. Yeah.
So the title of the ISIS magazine is called Rumiya, and you mentioned, and there was a quote on there talking about, we won't rest in our jihad until we're buried under the olive trees in Rome. What do they mean by Rome, and why are they talking about Rome?
So there is a hadith, a prophetic report, where the prophet is describing the future, and he says, there will come a time where the Muslims will conquer Constantinople, and then after that Rome. So, presumably that's what they have in mind. Now, of course, how Muslim scholars grapple with that report, how they interpret that report, you're going to have a range of views, but again, the issue of authenticity comes up. But in any case, that's what they're basing that on. Yeah. Yes.
So as a Muslim student that walks around Penn State, I've been here for 4 years, and you have to see people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher and HBO and all these shows, and they talk a lot about how what it means to be a moderate Muslim is as you said before, like these literalists, these people that even the moderate Muslims kind of support it. They show up all these statistics and polls that they make up and not make up, but that they find in London about Muslims who are anti-gay marriage, who support some of the violence against women or things like that. And a lot of the reports you see are like Muslims, younger generation Muslims, people my age, are becoming more radicalized. What advice would you give someone who is in that position? Like, what do you say to that, to something like that?
That's a hard question to answer. I think, my gut reaction is everybody needs to read up more. But that's not, I mean, what does that mean even? I don't know. Lifeline? Okay. I'm sorry.
That's not.
I grapple with that issue too. Maybe that's why I did the book, actually. Because I wanted to grapple with that issue a bit more.
But I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say people need to read up more.
Yeah.
People need
Yeah.
to assume the best on
Yeah.
the part of others.
Yeah.
And so the onus is put on you, but it needs to be on everybody else, frankly. So.
Yeah, and also I'll add here, so when you read like Sam Harris, for example, so in the End of Faith, chapter 1, he features this, he's highlighting this story in New York Times about a Palestinian failed suicide bomber. And it's right there, chapter 1, he's highlighting it. And he quotes the guy as saying, "I did this just for the love of martyrdom." And so the take-home message is, this is only because of religion. Politics, forget it. This is because of religion. And he references a New York Times article. Well, I go back and look at that New York Times article. Whoa, very different story. This is a guy who, there's so much, I'll just say this. He's giving this, he actually mentions political things. He talks about how if the Israelis don't do this, there'll be more suicide bombings in Jenin, and he gets very political. But he also says, I didn't do this to harm anybody. In fact, I didn't detonate the bomb. And you have these Israeli soldiers who are guarding him by the bed, who later tell the reporter he's lying. So, whoa, this is not the kind of thing that, Harris presents it and you're supposed to think, wow. But actually there's more to the story and they're not just details. And Richard Dawkins does the same thing in The God Delusion. He mentions another failed suicide bomber, Palestinian, and he does the same thing. Doesn't tell you at all. He has this quote where it's clearly a religious, there's like a religious dimension, but he ignores the political dimension, which appears later in that same article that he's quoting. So maybe just going back and checking out the sources that people are referencing, that might go a long way too. So, yes, in the back.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that from a Christian perspective, because I was interested, I didn't realize you were interested in new atheists. I'm interested in the new atheist objection to Christianity. And they do the same sort of move. There's a literalist interpretation, and I think a person of faith needs to dig down into one's own religion and find the truth that in one's own religion, and that's the source of defense against these objections. Reading is always good, and looking for the complexity that is always missing in the new atheist position.
Yes.
To try to see, what are the truths in one's religion, and what are the ways in which one's religion is used in problematic ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me just add here that some of the most outspoken critics of the new atheists have actually been atheists. Something to keep in mind. Yes?
I guess, what are your thoughts, and maybe even the other scholarly thoughts on approaching any religious text in a literal view? Because also from like a Christian perspective, to me, the times that the Christian name has gotten most, distant from what the Bible entails is when people take it literally
Mhm.
and they take it out of context.
Mhm.
I feel like literalism opens itself up to taking things out of context and taking it out of what was really the intent of that particular author, that prophet, whatever you want to denote the writer as.
I'll say this. The idea that you should take context into consideration is not a modern thing, and that should be stressed. So for example, in medieval times, you have Al-Qarafi, a famous Muslim legal scholar, who says if you're going to come up with any legal ruling, you have to understand the context of the prophet, and you have to understand your own context. Because if you just take things blindly, then that just shows you don't understand the religion. And this is somebody writing hundreds of years ago, right? So this is something that people have long recognized as a problem. When people just sort of take things literally. And I think there's an extent to which, I mean, I think most Muslims historically have recognized that there are limits to literalism. For example, there's a verse in the Quran that tells the Prophet to lower his wing to the believers. Well, clearly he doesn't have wings, right? So that's clearly metaphorical. But where do you draw the line? And that's something that I think people have always grappled with and struggled with. And of course, in modern times, with increased literacy, everyone has access now to the hadiths. And, it's interesting. In the old days, it was the scholars who had access to all the hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet, and so on. Because the average person didn't have access to these things. Now they have, you go to their homes and right there in their libraries, Sahih Bukhari and all that. And I remember once hearing, there was a famous Egyptian scholar, and I snuck into his class. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I snuck into his class, and he said, they were reading from hadiths of a collection of Tirmidhi. And there was a hadith that said, there was a hadith referencing, it says something like, okay, if you eat camel meat, you have to wash up for prayer again. And the scholar stopped us. He said, now look at this, look at this, look at this. The neophyte will look at this and think this is like a rule. That when you eat camel meat, you have to wash up for prayer. It's like a rule. But what this person doesn't realize is there's another report that explains this report. And what does that report say? My wife hates when I tell this story. You'll see why. There's another report that says that once the prophet was giving a sermon. And somebody passed gas. That's why my wife doesn't like this story, me telling this story. But somebody passed gas audibly. And the prophet said, well, whoever did that should, wash up for prayer. And then somebody said to the prophet, well, maybe this will embarrass that person. If they stand up, everybody will know who dealt it, right? Last night, a bunch of us were eating camel meat. So maybe we should all just go and wash up. And the prophet says, good idea. Whoever ate camel meat should wash up for prayer. That's not a rule. That's something for that context, for that moment. And so that was the point the scholar was making, is that you have to understand the whole tradition. You can't just take this or that. You have to understand the whole tradition. And the problem now is people, like this ISIS guy, who has no idea that the Prophet never did night raids. Right? He's saying it's best to attack at night. That goes against right there in Bukhari. The Prophet's, his practice, his normative practice. So anyway, yeah. Yes, sir.
This is sort of literalist too on my part. The Rumiyah article you're quoting was written in English, I gather.
Yes.
Is there an Arabic version of Rumiyah, and does it print the same articles?
So they do have Arabic publications. I forget now if there's an Arabic Rumiyah in particular. Because I know Rumiyah began when they lost the city of Dabiq, they stopped publishing Dabiq, and they started publishing Rumiyah. But is there an I know they for sure have Arabic publications, without a doubt, but do they have an Arabic Rumiyah? I know they translate Rumiyah, but is there an Arabic one? I honestly don't remember.
Because my suspicion is that they might write something different in Arabic.
Oh, yes.
Arabic
I think so.
And in English for
Absolutely.
the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Americans.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And actually, so there's an article in was it Rumiyah or Dabiq? I think it was Rumiyah, called "Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You." And there the author makes the claim that the primary reason ISIS is fighting Westerners is because they're not Muslim. Well, that goes against the statements of the Baghdadi, the leader, the caliph, various leaders of ISIS who have made it clear that what they're doing is defensive, as they perceive it. So, yeah, that's a good point. Other questions or comments? Yes.
I just read the book that actually you mentioned the author here, the Bernard Lewis.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And I believe in his book, he mentions that Islam is actually, like, in contrary to Christianity, is an expansionist religion, while Christianity is a pacifist.
Yeah.
Pacifist. Do you agree with
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So Bernard Lewis, what he's doing is he's promoting the expansionist interpretations of Islam, or that's what he's describing, the expansionist interpretation. So remember I said with Ismail Sorodin's work, she says that the scholars close to the political centers, they talk about expanding, and others just stress the defensive side. Well, what Bernard Lewis is doing is he's looking at the writings of those who talk about conquering the world. Okay, so Bernard Lewis believes Islam is supposed to conquer the world. At least that's how Muslims perceive it. But that's not the same as terrorism, right? Because with expansion, you still have rules of war. So the problem with terrorism then is that that's not really about expansionism or not, it's because usually terrorism is presented as defensive in nature, right? So Bin Laden says what we're doing is defensive in nature. So it's not about expansionism necessarily. It's more the rules of war. That's what Bernard Lewis is saying, that they're violating. The rules of war. Yeah, that's a good point though. Yeah.
Time for one more question?
Yes.
You keep referencing the book by Isma. What's the name?
Oh yeah. Striving in the Path of God.
Striving.
Striving in the Path of God, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It was published by Oxford University Press, 2014, 2015?
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.